welcome to our event this evening. We're very pleased to have with us Lawrence Millman. Thank you so much for your patience as we were getting set up. As you know, doing these virtual events means that we can speak to anyone around the country, but sometimes we have a little bit of technical difficulties getting started, just like any other event. So Lawrence is going to be speaking, and then the Q&A tonight will be via chat. He has a PowerPoint for us, so that's going to be really fun. His new book is called Fungipedia. Lawrence is both an author and a mycologist. So he's written 17 books. You can check those out at lawrencemillman.com. And he's also done mycological work around the world in places including Iceland, Honduras, and many other places around the globe, and also back east where he currently lives. This should be very fun and interesting. And again, thank you so much for staying with us while we got set up. We would love for you to take a look at the book on our website, which is bkwrks.com. This week, we're offering free shipping with the coupon code FREESHIP. So take a look at Fungipedia on there, and if you'd like to buy a copy, we would really appreciate you buying it from us. We're excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and cue Lawrence so that he can get his talk and PowerPoint going, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. All right, so Lawrence, take it away.
Okay. Welcome to a relatively new kingdom fungi. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Fungi were broken off from the plant kingdom only about 50 years ago. Before that, they were considered plants, and lowly plants to boot. But it's now been proven that they are far closer to us human beings genetically than plants are. Stay tuned for this tidbit of information. Now, I suspect you know what this is. Nod your head. It is a toadstool, and it represents an age-old phobia about mushrooms. Mushrooms and fungi are interchangeable words, but formally speaking, this toadstool is a mushroom. It could be that toadstool is German for death chair, Toadstuhl. Or the word could suggest that toads commonly, and this was a medieval notion, commonly sit on mushrooms and impart their venom to them. This is called mycophobia. And a perfect example is a poem by a greatly admired poetess named Emily Dickinson. I shall recite it, it's only 4 lines. Had nature any outcast face, could she a son condemn? Had nature an Iscariot, that mushroom, it is him. Emily was not alone in this prejudice. In my book, what I would like to do is remove the toad from the stool, and so that you can see mushrooms as they really are. And by the way, this is a fly agaric Amanita muscaria redcap mushroom that I devote quite a bit of attention to in the book because it is considered the iconic mushroom. Among other things, it's the so-called Alice in Wonderland mushroom. Anyway, now, there has been recently the opposite of a phobia. It's a current spike in interest in mushrooms and an affection rather than a phobia. As you can see from this woman 150 years ago, there would be a look of horror on her face as she moved away from the mushroom rather than next to it with a big smile on her face. Um, so the spike has gone so far as to indicate that mushrooms or fungi can save the world. And as you can see, what these two fellows are doing are bowing to, and this is what's called an artist conch, and you can draw whatever you wish to draw on the underside if you are an artist, or even if you're not. And so this has a religious connotation, and there was a film called Fantastic Fungi, and it also used the mushrooms can save the world phrase. And my own feeling, and that's in the book, is that they can save the world simply by being themselves, not by being utilized by human beings. For human uses, always destroy the natural world. The rainforest in South America, we don't want to cut it down because who knows, all these trees and plants could help cure cancer. Well, how do you do that? You cut the trees and plants down to see if they can help cure cancer. I would love to see organisms like mushrooms left alone, and the word use, the 3-letter equivalent of a 4-letter word, being not used. I'll go into that a bit more later in this presentation, but now I'm going to be a little bit autobiographical, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own, how I got interested in fungi myself. I did ethnographic work in the Arctic. I hung out with native people and collected their lore and superstitions, stories, customs, and medicines, like the two elderly Inuit in this photo. I think this is from about 1993. They were still, although they were both in their 70s, semi-nomadic, living in this caribou hide tent. And every once in a while, I would hear a bit of fungal lore. See, I didn't come to fungi through the psychedelic route or through the culinary route. I came more through the ethnographic route. Now, this is a 101-year-old Vuntut-Wichan woman in the northern Yukon. And if you look here, I don't know, I don't have a pointer, but can you see what I'm pointing to? Right here in the lower left-hand corner. This is what's called a polypore. And it's a false tinder polypore. I'm not going to give you Latin names here. Burned to ash, tobacco leaf wrapped around it, and then chewed. And this gives the person a nicotine blast. And this woman, you know, is a very traditional woman, and this is traditional, at least go back to the time of the whalers who brought the tobacco leaves. Before that, it was willow leaves. Willow is salix, salicine, healthy. Now the alkaloid in the, excuse me, it all gives a nicotine blast. And this woman is extraordinarily ebullient. And I asked her to what she owed her ebullience. And she said, clean water, living in the country, moose meat, and this. I said, oh, how long have you been chewing that? And she looked thoughtful for a moment and said, oh, about 90 years. Well, here's an example, I suppose, of mycophobia in Greenland, especially in the Arctic and in Greenland. Mushrooms have a slime on them. And there's a reason for this. It serves as an antifreeze in cold weather. In some temperate regions, they have a slime too, but far more commonly in northern regions. It's, you know, an antifreeze to protect the fruiting body, the mushroom, from freezing. However, in East Greenland, they're called kivitok sopa. A kivitok is a mountain hermit who flexes his fingers and flies through the air. And in doing so, I mean, he flies to a village and he has a habit of snatching people and eating them. This is really, it can be upsetting. And it is thought that the slime on a mushroom, kivitok sopa, kivitok soap, is how a kivitok washes himself. And if that's how it's used, for God's sakes, you would not want to eat it, would you? Now here's another, this is, of course, these are all part of the book. In the canoe, Raven in the bow, and someone called Fungus Man in the stern. He is the personification of a particular polypore, Lyriciformes officinalis, called sometimes the quinine conch. And this is the story an old Haida man told me, that Raven here created the world and then he created men, but he didn't know what to do next. And all these men were standing around with perplexed expressions on their face. And Fungus Man here said, I know how to solve this problem. And he took Raven to the island where female genitalia lived. This is how he described it to me. They were skittering over the rocks and Raven got a giant bucket, put the genitalia in. They paddled back and onto half of the men, he pasted these genitalia. The other half looked at that half in wonderment and astonishment and delight. And you know what happened. Anyway, as the old man who told me this story said, and if it weren't for Fungus Man, I wouldn't be here telling you this story, nor would you be here listening to it. So we all owe our origins to that person. I had my interest ignited from ethnomycology to actual mycology by this gentleman who is in this picture about 91. His name is Sam Ristich. He was an entomologist as well as a mycologist. So he had a broad view of fungi. It wasn't just looking at them themselves. He saw them as they related to the natural world. And that gave me a contextual view that I show you in the book Fungipedia, but also that I use in real life. I don't, in other words, look at a mushroom and say, oh, is it edible? And if not, look away. Indeed, for me, edibility is perhaps the least interesting thing about any mushroom. He also was enthused about odd species, and he would yell, upon finding something odd, he'd say, ain't ma nature an interesting gal? Anyway, he kindled my enthusiasm and told me to get down and dirty with mushrooms. And here I am in a northern lake in the Arctic, Pingarwalloit crater. And I'm getting down and dirty. I have a knife, which you can see, and a mosquito net, which you can also see. I would not be alive today if I did not have that mosquito net. And I'm looking for small things in the moss. Now, as I said, I'm not terribly interested in fungal edibility, but I am interested in critters that eat mushrooms, like this millipede here, which I saw, I mean, going into a state of overdrive in its excitement on finding what's called a rusula. And I also have been very interested, I don't know if you have slugs in New Mexico. Do you? Yes. Different species of slugs have different tastes in different mushrooms. So you'll see one type of slug on one mushroom, but it will never deign to be on another. And the same would be true of other slugs. Maybe one day I can come to New Mexico and document this on a mushroom walk. Now, this is mushrooms also like to eat mushrooms. This is a mushroom that, nod your heads if you think you know what it is. Yes, it's called the lobster mushroom. And it's really a parasitized mushroom that ends up looking like a lobster. And it is a very good edible. It's a hypomyces, and this is a parasitic fungus that attacks, in this species, it's lactiflorum, hypomyces lactiflorum, either Rhizal or lactarius. Neither is edible in and of themselves, but together in this combination, they're considered a superb edible. And I'm sure you've eaten it, the fellow who nodded his head in the affirmative. Now, it's hard to take a picture of the vegetative part of any fungus because it's only one cell wide. So what I'm showing you is what's called Rhizomorphs, Rhizomorphs. These are mycelia that are bundled together to the tune of about 100. And they do this when they're moving to a new territory, a new log, for instance, to explore for food, also underground. And I put it in there because it is a more or less considered a blown up replica of what the mycelium in the wood or underground would look like. And a certain celebrity mycologist named Paul Stamets refers to it as nature's internet. And you can see as it's reaching out for nutrients, why that might be an adequate description of it. Now, this is what happens. Some of them will reach out to the roots of a plant or tree and form what's called a myco-fungal rhizal root relationship. This is symbiotic. It is passing on nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen to those roots, which will then carry them to the tree or plant. In return, what's happening is the plant or tree, photosynthesizing, is passing carbs onto the mycelium. But one reason I'm going on at length about this is it's extraordinarily important for 90 to 95% of all plants. Plus, we live in a time of climate change. What's happening is that the tree is taking a very nasty molecule called CO2 out of the atmosphere and passing it on to its fungal partner. The more eager the fungal partner is, the more CO2 is taken down, because then the fungal partner will give more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to the roots, and then it will bring down more stuff from more carbs from above. Fungi cannot photosynthesize. They're like us. They're what's called heteromorphs. They're taking their nutrients from their immediate environment rather than from that thing up in the sky called the sun. And if you start thinking in terms of building, construction, etc., you're destroying this relationship, you're cutting down trees and so on, the result is more CO2 will remain in the atmosphere, aiding and abetting more climate change. Now, in wood, and one of my areas of interest is fungi that grow in wood. This is called cubicle rot or brown rot. And 80% of the time it's a conifer. I mean, often walking through the forest, I think you can see logs that have these cubes on them. And what's happening is a fungus is dining on the cellulose in the wood and leaving the lignin, and that's brown. And it's turning the log itself into cubes. This is very beneficial to especially northern coniferous forest, because these cubes have great water holding capacity. They enrich soils and they make those soils highly favorable for seed germination. So the rotting of wood is absolutely essential in an ecological sense. What you can see here. Now this is what's called a turkey tail. And I think you have that in your neck of the woods, yes? Good, yes. And it's a polypore, and it's a white rotter. It takes the lignin and leaves the cellulose. And as a result, logs or stumps that you see that are sort of loose and cottony and seem to crumble in your hands, that's the work of a white rotter. And that aids and abets the soil too. One of the other things I should mention here, when you see turkey tails, you see a lot of them on a log, as in this photo. And you almost never see any other fungus. Why is that, you might ask yourself? Well, the reason is it's released, the mycelium in the wood is releasing a pheromone that says, stay away, this is my food. And most of the fungi in wood do that. They're competitive about their meals, and they're trying to get the finer portions for themselves. What the turkey tail does is it prevents the mycelium of other fungi to go into much action. So you don't see too many other mushrooms on a log where you see a turkey tail. Now there are parasitic mushrooms. This, by the way, is not one of them. Happens to be a woodpecker. And, they're recyclers. If they could talk, they might say, life comes from dying. Because mostly in the forest, parasitic fungi attack old trees or older trees, and in doing so, they open the canopy for new trees and ground plants. This is important, but the reason I put this avian in the photo is that wood that has been digested by a fungus is soft, and for cavity nesting birds, what they will do, and I'm not making this up, they will look around for a fungus growing out of a tree because they know that's an indication of soft wood, and it will be much easier for them to make a nest in there than it would be if there was no fungus sticking out of the tree. You savvy? Yes? All right. Fungi come in a remarkable variety of shapes and colors that would make any artist green with envy. And these are cup fungi, and believe it or not, they're close relatives to the morel. I'm sure you know what morels are. You know, Jordan, I'm sure. Imagine these cups soldered together and then put into a vertical pose. That is why they're related. Genetically, they're very, very closely related. Of course, these aren't edible, and the morel is considered by some an excellent edible. Now, one of the things that interests me, this is a tooth fungus. And you can see why it's called a tooth fungus. It has teeth coming down. I took this photo, and you can tell I'm not really much of a photographer, but the teeth coming down, and this is an evolutionary adaptation that says, with these teeth, I can create and spread spores much better than any other way, with pores or with gills. And here I should mention that this is a species I found in 2009 in Massachusetts, where I live, and I couldn't identify it. And I sent it to experts who couldn't identify it, who sent it to other experts who couldn't identify it. And finally, one woman, a Japanese woman, succeeded in identifying it. It was an Asian species that had never been seen in the New World before. And there it was. That's why it was so hard to identify. I should mention a couple of things. Fungi are great travelers, and they don't need a boarding pass either. They taxi their way around via animals, human beings. Anything that moves will help taxi the spores around. One of the other things that's happening, and this is not the result of that, is with climate change, a lot of southern species are coming up north. And as an anecdote, 1 week ago, I was walking along the Charles River in Cambridge. I found a polypore, and by now you might know what they are. Turkey tail is a polypore. I couldn't identify it. I didn't know what the hell it was. And I've spent much of my time in the last week, when not eating and drinking, trying to identify this specimen. Not this one, of course, but the one I'm talking about. And at last today, I succeeded in doing so. It's a tropical species, and there it was in New England. And it is one of many examples that have been documented where a southern species with climate change has worked its way north. Now, fungi are as I mentioned the size and all that, they have incredible evolutionary adaptations. I don't think you have this. It's formerly Zarula, now Hymenopellis species, best known for its long stem. You have this in New Mexico? Probably not, but this is close to 2 feet long. It's growing on buried wood, and it can reach down 2 feet into the ground and grow on that wood. If there was something that was above the ground and easier of access, wouldn't be interested, because it has evolved to grow on deeply buried wood. And we're admiring it because, you know, it has its own little ecological niche. Now, here are more polypores, and these can be either what's called saprophytes, and you may know that term from botany. A dead or dying substrate would be what would be edible, or a parasite, which attacks a healthy living thing. This is called the belted polypore, and it can be both. It can grow on a living tree that's perfectly healthy and reduce it eventually to, well, I won't say rubble, because there will be probably 30 other fungal species whose mycelia are working away at it as well. Or it could be a saprophyte, and this trunk could be a mere stump or snag, and it would be growing on that. So, you know, it's very egalitarian in its dining interests. Now, I mentioned what? I think I've missed some things here, but maybe not. Yes, okay, this is a purple Cortinarius, and it's beautiful. You see it in the field. And mycology, as I said, is a very young science. No one would be able to tell you why it's purple and not green, orange, red, yellow, or aquamarine in color. This is an area, and you know, I like to think of young mycologists growing up considering questions like this, as well as questions about its ecological nature, as well as, of course, admiring its beauty. We don't know. I mean, their guesses. Sometimes attracting insects is a reason for coloration, sometimes not. Sometimes, and an example will be coming up shortly, you'll see. But here, the whole point is spores, and everything is connected in the fungal world. Color, shape, smell, spores, and all of it is dedicated to producing more spores, which produce more mycelia, which produce more fungi, and so on ad infinitum. And I've got the measurements here. Spores are very, very small. These are going to be about 18 microns in diameter. And the meadow mushroom, you may know that. It's a common species. It's the wild colleague of the supermarket button mushroom, which has been so cultivated as to be perpetually a button and thus not produce spores. The meadow mushroom, which is very common in yards, you see it in lawns that have been watered, will produce upwards of 30,000 spores a second. A polypore, like this one, in its lifetime, and this is a perennial, could produce, I don't know, I wonder if we can give a prize to the person who has the closest guess at the end. How many spores, let's say, in its lifetime? Consider that. So at any rate, I talked about colors being attractors or distractors. This color, not so much the color, but the smell. This is what's known as a stinkhorn, and that's what's called its gleba. It attracts flying insects to come and spread its spores. It's known as Phallus impudicus, or the impudent phallus. And in Iceland, where I've lived, names that are not Icelandic are handed out to local people. And a poet friend of mine was asked to find an Icelandic name for this. And she came up with the phrase that translated into English as nasty male genitals. Now, I'm also going to read, oh yes, I put this in the book, but I saw a relation of this in a cemetery in Reykjavik, Iceland. And it was a relation that looks a lot like this, but has a different colored cap. And I took an Icelandic friend there, to show him he was not knowledgeable about mushrooms. And he saw this rising up from the ground, and he said, I suspect slightly in jest, "Oh, well, he died happy." Now, you can see this. You may know what this is. It's Ophiocordyceps. These are fungi that specialize in attacking ants. Now, the ones that are sold as aphrodisiac are not attacking ants. They're attacking underground moth larvae. But this type, which we have here in North America, specializes in attacking ants. And its mycelium gets into the ant. The spores can actually sniff out the ant. And they can determine different species of ant too, and the ones they want. This shows far more intelligence than what I have with respect to the species of ants. They get in and they force it to climb up a tree. And then they affix their mandibles onto a leaf. This actually should have been vertical, to tell the truth, onto a leaf or a branch. And they're up above at a certain height. And the whole point is they want to drop their spores down. If they're on the ground or the ant's on the ground, it won't work. But they're dropping them specifically down over an area where ants are forming their entourages, so more of them will be parasitized. Very cunning, as Sherlock Holmes would say. Now, some species are so cute that you could say that they inspire our oxytocin and make us want to cuddle them. Here's an example, and I haven't yet been able to identify it. I photographed that in the Yukon last summer. And it may be an undescribed species for all I know. Anyway, oxytocin, as you probably know, is referred to as the cuddle hormone. Now, when I say you want to cuddle them, I'm wondering, I might be engaging in a bit of anthropomorphism here. There's an example of anthropomorphism, glasses over a fungus. But my own feeling is, well, I'm distantly related to the organism in question. We both have a common ancestor, a 500 million year old plankton-like creature. Plants have a totally different ancestry. So maybe it's not as anthropomorphic as you might think. And they do inspire this. And I should add that a lot of new scientific papers are becoming much more popular in the titles and more anthropomorphic. Two examples: dating in the dark, how roots respond to fungal mycelia, and indifferent, affectionate, or deceitful lifestyles of fungi. So I am not solely the only anthropomorphic mycologist around. Now, I mentioned the spike of interest in fungi, and there is an example. Now, it may not look terribly cuddly to you, but I bet some people may know what this is. It's called chaga, C-H-A-G-A. It's from a fungus it's the sclerotium, which means it's not producing spores. It is a growth created by the mycelium. And what's happening is it tends to grow on a birch tree or a hop hornbeam, which is in the same family as a birch. And the mycelium doesn't like the different alkaloids that the birch is releasing to try to kill it off, because the birch does not really like to have this in its innards. The result could indeed be death. So what's happening is the mycelium is taking it and concentrating those alkaloids, one of which is betulinic acid, in this particular entity. And one reason why it's considered such an incredible medicinal, and I am a little dubious about all this, I must say, is that it has a concentrated amount of betulinic acid. And it's said that it could, all the things it could cure, cancer, dropsy, epilepsy, chronic cynicism. I'm not sure about that. But one of the things I think is happening, and fungi are being, I won't say, well, exploited, is that people are turning their backs, turning away from big pharma, which they're tired of, and for good reasons. And they're also trying to get back in touch with nature and what could be a better option than medicinal mushrooms, of which this is perhaps the iconic one. But most people who make a tea out of chaga don't know that it's not really the mushroom, it's not the spore bearer. This is. Now, I'm referring not to her, but that. I don't think she bears spores. But it's right on this birch stump, and it is so-called fruiting body. It's a polypore, but a lot of polypores are what's known as resupinate. And if you know the word supine, you'll know what resupinate means, meaning they just grow flat along the surface of their woody substrate. And that's what happens here. But this is growing even under the bark, and it's attracting insects to come and spread its spores. It's giving off a pheromone. And to me, far more interesting than the fact that chaga could be an immune system potentiator is the fact that the actual mushroom has developed a way to get flying insects to come and spread its spores. Different type of pheromone altogether from the stinkhorns. This is seldom seen because by the time, the bark breaks and, you see it, it looks like, at best, a moth-eaten rag. And that's why this doesn't look terribly charismatic. So here is an example of what I call over-harvesting, over-collecting. And it's done all the time at regional forays, and people who go out in the woods with baskets do it all the time. And it's somewhat of a nuisance from a fungal point of view, because what's happening is that if you collect too many specimens of a particular mushroom, you're limiting that species' genetic diversity, not to mention the future dispersal of spores. And this will make the mushroom less able to perform its ecological role and will affect the health of the planet. People will tell you, or tell me, when we collect mushrooms, hell, we're not damaging the mycelium. Well, that's not exactly true, because the mycelium is putting an incredible amount of its biomass into the mushroom in question. So you are damaging it. So what I would recommend is that instead of collecting mass amounts of mushrooms, as in this photo, you do what these two gentlemen are doing, and you gaze in wonder at the mushrooms. Or you do what this gentleman is doing and taking photos of the mushroom. Or you do what this lady did. Recognize her? Beatrix Potter, she started out as a mycologist, but she was a woman, and thus she could not attend mycological meetings. She wrote papers, but she couldn't read them at meetings. Effectively, she was banned. And she had no choice but to become a kid's artist, cute little bunny rabbits like Peter Rabbit. Another less known woman, Mary Banning, did wonderful drawings in the mid and late 19th century of mushrooms, like this for example, but no one would even communicate her except one mycologist. All her other letters went unanswered. And the one man who was a New York State mycologist named Charles Peck, she said, "You are my one friend in the dubious world of fungi." And I doubt that they would have said this, but when she was seen in the woods collecting mushrooms, her fellow Marylanders would say, shake their heads and say, "Poor thing's gone clean mad." So virtually everything I told you here is in my book, Fungipedia, which is immediately available, I'm sure, from Bookworks. And I'm only sorry I won't be able to inscribe a copy for you, but maybe one of these days I'll come to Albuquerque and do so. And I hope that I have proven to you that fungi are not toadstools, but they can be salamander stools, as you can see from this picture. These are people I'd like to thank. And initially I was going to play a piece of music, but it proved too difficult. So there's a entry in Fungipedia to this gentleman who was an eccentric Czech mycologist and also a musician who would get down and listen to mushrooms, record their songs. He had a notebook, record their songs, and then turn them into pieces of music. So anyway, thank you so much.